raised in Southern Ontario, Vanessa Farnsworth is a writer and journalist who makes her home in the British Columbia interior. She received her education from York University, the Humber School for Writers, and the print journalism program at Sheridan College, where she received the T.J. Allen Memorial Award for journalism. Her numerous articles on nature, the environment, and agriculture have appeared in magazines across Canada, and her short fiction has been published in Canadian and American literary journals. Vanessa is the author of 3 books: Rain on a Distant Roof, A Personal Journey Through Lyme Disease in Canada, The Things She'll Be Leaving Behind, and most recently, The Haweaters. Congratulations on the release of your newest book. Do you want to tell us a little about it?
Yes, it's a historical novel and it's called The Haweaters, and it is based on a real-life murder, actually double murder, that happened on Manitoulin Island back in 1877. And so this story has actually been traveling around the Manitoulin Island for many generations now. I'm the 5th generation who's heard the story, and I think everybody's got a different version on what happened that night. And so I'm descended from the people who were murdered. And so they had 6 children who made it to adulthood. And so if you just figure, if all 6 children had 2 kids and they had 2 kids and they had 2 kids, there's a lot of people who are descended from the murder victims. It was William Bryan and his son Charles who were killed. And so we all have these different takes, right? Because there is the actual documentation, which I tracked down. So the trial records, which tell you the facts of what happened. But there's also the family lore and the family version. So we all have slightly different takes on what happened. So I basically went with the version that my grandmother's cousin wrote down in a pamphlet in 1993. So it was this series called Through the Years that's published at the Manitoulin Expositor. And he gave his version of the story. And it is a quirky little thing because it's not just narrative. It's got snippets from depositions. It's got drawings that were used at the trial. It's got a wanted poster in there. And so that's the version that basically I based the book on. It is the version that's the best known version outside the family because of this pamphlet that was published in 1993. And of course, I go back to the trial documents as well, because there was a lot of questionable behavior and a lot of rumors and innuendo that I think when my grandmother's cousin told the story, he kind of cleaned it up a bit, maybe made the family members look a little bit better than they really were. And so, of course, I'm more of a creative writer. I'm not going to offend anybody who's been dead for 150 years. So I just said, I'm gonna dirt and all. I'm just going to put the entire story in there, and so it was great fun learning all the facts behind it, and it was great fun hearing all the different versions of it, and then of course to distill that down into this historical novel that I eventually went with.
Did your family members know that you were writing this book?
Well, my mom did. So I got the story. She got the story from my grandma. I got it from my mom. My grandma died actually in 2011. So there wasn't really anybody to offend. It was just, am I going to offend my mom? And basically she read the book and she said, wow, you sure didn't whitewash the family, did you? You know, it's like, okay. I wasn't really worried too much about offending anyone because we're talking about people who died 150 years ago. Wow. So there's no chance I'm going to libel anybody. We all have our versions of what happened, but none of us really know the truth of what happened that night, because one thing I learned from reading all the trial documentation and the appeals documentation is most people who testified lied. And some people lied because they wanted the murderer hanged. And actually there were 2 murderers, they wanted them hanged, and some people lied because they wanted them to walk free. But because there were so many people telling so many lies, it's really difficult to know what happened. We know certain things for sure. We know that William and Charles Bryan were murdered. We know that George and Laban Amer were the murderers. We know that it happened in June of 1877, and then we have divergence from there. So it was fun. It was like your very own mystery, just trying to figure it out.
Now, you're out in BC right now.
I am, yes. I am the only member of my family who lives in BC. So I was actually raised in Southern Ontario. But my grandmother was the first generation born off the island. So we were on Manitoulin Island for several generations there. And then my grandmother was born on the North Shore and migrated down to southern Ontario.
So did you come back to do your research, or how did you start researching everything?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist. So I start where journalists typically start, which is trying to nail down the facts. So you have this family lore and you have this version of the story that was told by a family member. So the first question I had was, is it really true? Did this murder really happen? Can I place all of these people on the island at the same time? And it was just starting there. So Library and Archives Canada was wonderful. They had all of the documents relating to the appeal process of that from that original murder conviction, and the Archives of Ontario had the original trial documents, which were a total cache. I mean, it's got first person testimony all the way through there. It was just absolutely magnificent documents. And eventually I did. I got a grant to go to the island, so I could just go to every single museum on the island, and I could go through all of their records of all the family histories there, and I could talk to people who still live on the island who are descended from these people as well. So it was like I said, it was a lot of fun doing it. Yeah, so for me, it started with being a family member. So it was two family members who were killed, but then it sort of took off from there. I just got really fascinated by this murder because I sort of heard a version of it that was a little bit polite to our side of the family. And so when you actually go through and see what they were up to, you get the sense that they weren't innocent victims of what happened to them, that they were very much participants in their own murders, and that fight that happened that night could have gone either way. You know, if one side hadn't brought a gun, there were enough weapons there between the two sides that it would have been, you know, anyone's guess who would have lived and who would have died. So, you know, if you're going to bring clubs to a gunfight, you know, you're probably not going to win.
Wow.
So, yeah.
And approximately how long did it take for you to write this book?
A long time. Because I couldn't find all the documentation that I was looking for in one place. It actually, maybe from the time I started, took about 5 years of research to really do that. So I always knew that I was going to do something with the story back in 1993. When I first saw that story, I thought, I mean, it's told in such a snippets from somebody who's a non-writer. And I thought, well, if you could just take a writer's skill, right, and just go after the story, you could mine it for a lot of stuff. So I always knew I was going to do it. So it was in the back of my mind. And it wasn't until it's around the time that my grandmother died that I thought, you know, maybe it's time that we just tell this story right once and for all. And so, yeah, so about 5 years. And, you know, it wasn't necessarily obvious where these things were located. Like, okay, there was a murder that happened on Manitoulin Island. So if there was a trial, where would those records be exactly? And so that's where a lot of this detective work came in, is who has them and can I find them? And it took a lot of searching to find them. And of course, it makes sense that the Archives of Ontario and Library of Archives Canada would have these things, but you know, there's a lot of misspellings and things. So it got really tricky. Like, you know, one of the people in there, Eleanor Bryan, I think I've seen 2 or 3 different spellings of her name, and George Amer, his last name in some documents is Ames, so Aemes. So you had to sort of look for variations on spellings. You had to do all of these strange things just to try to figure out, well, who could possibly have these documents at this point? And where can I find them? And land registry records are something that normally I wouldn't have thought to look at, but they tell you a whole lot about when these people arrived on the island and what their financial situation was, whether they were able to pay cash for the land, whether they had to pay installments, whether they ever actually paid the full installments or had their land repossessed. I mean, you can learn a huge amount of people just from those records. But of course, where would land registry records from the 1870s from Manitoulin Island be located? The answer is Library and Archives Canada, but it took a lot of searching around through all sorts of obscure places to finally find them there.
Wow. And I just have to ask, in this journey in writing this story, did anything come out that surprised you or something unexpected?
Oh yeah, there were a whole lot of unexpected things. Like I said, George Skippin's version was a very cleaned up version. So, we had, there are allegations made in court, for instance, that William Bryan, on the day he was murdered, actually beat his wife very badly, that her son, who was also murdered, beat her badly as well. There were suggestions that maybe there was some sexual impropriety going on between the murderer, George Amer, and Eleanor Bryan, who was the wife of the murder victim and the mother of the other murder victim. There was a suggestion in the version that I saw that, when it came to weaponry, the Amers sort of showed up at the Bryan property, and they had, with a truncheon, they had a handgun, a revolver, they had a hunting knife, and then on the other side, the Bryans had these ironwood clubs that they had made themselves. Well, it turns out they also had an axe as well. So these people were not needing to come up with a peaceful resolution to their differences. These people were going there to do battle. And I think if it hadn't been for the gun, it may have turned out very differently.
Mm-hmm.
But, wow. So you learn. So that was interesting to learn, is that your own family, you couldn't, I mean, even in the trial documents, not very many people said nice things about them. I mean, they basically said they were not great people. So you're thinking, I'm taking on this story about my own family, in which I'm discovering that maybe they were not the nicest people who ever lived. And maybe they kind of deserved what they got. I mean, they asked for it so many different ways that it's not really surprising that what happened. So yeah, there were a lot of surprises.
Well, you know what? I could see a lot of readers now thinking, I want to write about family stories inspired by events because it actually sounds quite intriguing. Your story sounds fascinating. Any advice for any reader who is now pondering writing stories inspired by family or real life events?
Yeah, for sure. The first thing I would say is you have to tell the truth, and you have to be prepared to tell the truth. I think there's this protective thing we tend to do where we don't want to air our dirty laundry in public. Families tend not to want to put it out there, but as a writer, you kind of have to put it out there. Because if you don't, if you pull back, then you sort of come in shallow on the story and it doesn't really resonate. People can tell when you're not telling the full story, and it comes off very surfacey. So that's the first thing I would tell people, is you have to go with the truth as you find it. You have to sometimes make judgments on people that you would prefer not to make. You'd like to see your family as nicer than they could be. So you have to be prepared for that, and also have a good sense of the universal. Because we all know when we see people's vacation slides, I guess now it's pictures, digital pictures, but and they get very boring very quickly, right? Because you don't know what's going on or the people involved, and it's hard to connect with somebody's photo album. And this is basically what you're doing, is taking your photo album and just select pictures from it and putting it out in public. And so you have to have this idea of what the universal is. What is interesting about this family story to somebody who's not actually a member of your family, or maybe has never met these people? And that can be a little bit tricky, but you get the hang of it. And once you're on draft 10, you've pretty much figured out, okay, people don't really want to know about this because this is really nothing, but this is really interesting. So you sort of reduce this entire story down to about 8 or 9 of the most interesting facts about the story, and then go from there. And also, if you're telling a story like I did, where no one in this story is within living memory, personality becomes an interesting thing. So what the personalities are in your family. So I know what the women are like in my family. So when I'm going back and I'm writing about Eleanor Bryan, who would have been my great grandmother, I know what the women in my side of the family, that side of the family, are like. So I can sort of give her a personality. And with somebody like Annie Amer, who went to a great deal of effort to make sure her husband and son did not rot in a jail or hang. she wrote a lot of letters. So from those letters, you can get a sense of who she is. And of course, from trial testimony, you can get a sense of who other people are. So you may have to embellish a little bit on personalities if you're writing about people who are dead and have been dead for a long period of time, because there's not really anybody you can ask. You can't, I could say to my grandma, well, what was he like? Well, he died before I was born, obviously, in 1877. I'm not that old, right? So, but she, one of William and Eleanor Bryan's their youngest daughter was who I'm related to. And she lived to be 103. So she was still alive in 1969, the beginning of 1969, she died. So she's somebody who was very much in the memory of my grandmother. She was very much in the memory of my mother. They both knew her. So I didn't know the people who were killed, but I knew the daughter of the man who was killed and the sister of one of the people who were killed. So that was incredibly useful. So families can give you all sorts of details that you can't get from a court record. Just about the daily lives and the personalities of people. But yeah, if you're going to write about your own family, picking members who are long dead is probably the best way to go. If you pick members who are still alive, boy, Christmas dinner could be really interesting.
Right. Thank you. Actually, another author and I were talking about just the whole writing process, and we got into a very lively conversation about fonts. I love fonts. By chance, do you have a favorite font?
I do. Whenever I'm writing, I always put everything in Cochin.
Oh, really?
Cochin. I don't know why I like that font so much, but whenever I'm writing something and it's not in that font, it just doesn't look official to me. So it doesn't matter whether I'm writing a magazine article or a short story or a novel. I always put everything into that font. And then, of course, when you send it out to an editor, I just put it into Times New Roman, because that seems to be what the industry standard is. But yeah, and of course, I'm getting older now. My eyes don't work as well. So it's 14-point Cochin. That's what I use on everything. So yeah, I think writers, we do tend to get a little bit more passionate about fonts than the average person.
It's true.
Because we stare at them so much,
Oh my God.
It's like, you've got to have something that looks right to you.
Right. Actually, it would be amazing to do a survey, and I might actually follow up and just see. Do you ever write longhand, or do you key all your information in directly? Now I'm asking you questions about your writing process.
Exactly. Well, in my case, yes. I do longhand a lot of the time. I still do longhand. So when I started out as a journalist in 1992, that was really the way you did it. We weren't taking notes on computers back then. So when I'm sitting in a room now, so if I'm sitting somewhere where there's a group of other people who are listening to speakers, the number of journalists in the room who are actually typing on devices now, it just blows my mind. Or using recording devices, which is really the long way around, knowing shorthand and knowing, or even longhand, it's so much fast. So yeah, I do a combination. Basically, I tend to write first drafts longhand, and I do almost all the editing on a computer, because once it's in the computer, it's just so easy to print it off. And that's what I do. I print it off. I don't actually edit on the screen. Someday maybe I will, but I'm thinking at this point, I've been doing this long enough that I just have it down the way I personally like to do it. So, and with a novel, usually it starts on cue cards anyways, not cue cards on a computer, but one's up on a board on my wall, right? So you just write on index cards or cue cards all the way on the wall. You sort of order your scenes that way. Then you start making notes for the first draft. Then you make the first draft. All of that's longhand. Then it gets transcribed onto the computer. And then from that point on, it's a matter of editing on paper and inputting it onto the screen. It might be the long way around to do it that way, but I find when you're writing something like a story or a novel, taking the time to think about what you're doing and what you're thinking and what the motivations of characters are actually is really helpful to be slow about it. I think Hemingway used to make this distinction between writing and typing, right? I think he was really down on the typers. I'm not really down on the typers. It's a different way of working, but I think when you do it longhand, it just slows you down enough that I seem to be able to type faster than I can think, right? So if I'm doing something that slows me down, then I can't really outthink my hands. So yeah, so I find that it works really well because a lot of time when you're writing something like a novel or a story, you're thinking a lot about motivation and you're trying to drop yourself into the thinking of this character and why am I doing what I'm doing in this particular scene.
Right, right.
And I just find that that works a lot better if I'm just doing it longhand.
Wow. Actually, I think there's a lot of science. There's been a lot of studies done actually about handwriting versus typing because different parts of the brain and different hemispheres are accessed depending on what you're doing. So,
Right. Oh,
yeah,
I didn't
so
know that, but that's interesting. Yeah, somebody's always studying something, isn't it?
and writing. Speaking of, at this point, given these uncertain times, what are some ways readers can support you and the release of your new book right now?
Oh, you know what's really great? I think all writers would agree about this is rating the book or writing a brief review on any place like Amazon or Chapters or Goodreads, anything like that. Because I know as a reader that when I'm looking at a book that I think might be interesting, I like to read the comments that people are leaving so I know whether it's worth my time or not, right? So that's what I would say to anybody. Once you've read my book, good, bad, or ugly, just read a review so people know, like if there's something you didn't like about the book, write that down, right? So people know what's good about it, what's bad about it, and whether they should take their time to do it. And I think that's something that, these days, I mean, the industry has changed. I've been writing since 1992, so a very long time, and the industry has changed remarkably over that period of time. And one thing that has happened is that there's not that many book reviewers anymore. And so we're all suffering because there's only a few places that do book reviews. And so most books that get released in Canada don't ever get reviewed by anybody. And I personally think reader reviews are as good as anybody else's reviews. You know when you're reading a book whether you liked it or not. You know right away. And it's not hard to hit that little star button, right? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 stars. Just go out and do that. And if you have time to write a sentence or two about my book or anybody else's book, I think all authors would appreciate that.
Absolutely. And finally, do you have any upcoming events or anything that you want to share with viewers?
What am I doing these days? No, actually, I don't think I do right now. There's going to be a book launch for sure, but it's going to be a virtual book launch. And so I have a website, vanessafarnsworth.com, and there's an events section on there. So I always add things when I have them coming up. But right now I'm in the process of setting things up. So people should check back because I'm thinking that there's going to be at least half a dozen online events between now and October. But I haven't solidified anything yet. So that's sort of where I'm at right now, is just trying to nail down those details. In this time we're in, when everybody's so afraid of COVID-19, everything has to be online and we have to somehow all get comfortable with the technology.
And you're on social media?
I am vaguely on social media. I am not the biggest fan of Facebook and Twitter. I actually did both of those things for 5 years, and I found they took a lot of time. And I couldn't say, like, I'm a working writer, and I couldn't really say that it was selling any books or getting me any readers that would have found me otherwise. So I'm on LinkedIn. For all those people on LinkedIn, I'm on Goodreads. So if you happen to be one of the people who likes Goodreads, I'm on there. And right now, until the end of August, I don't know when this is going to go on your site, on your YouTube channel, but until the end of August, there is a free giveaway. I'm giving away 20 copies of my book on Goodreads. So anybody who sees this before August 31st, it's your chance to get potentially a free copy.
We will get this up by this Friday.
Excellent.
So that and again,
so more people,
we'll share that on our social media channels as well. Well, Vanessa, thank you so much. Oh my gosh, I can't believe how fast the time has passed. But we really, really, really appreciate you supporting our brand new YouTube initiative. And thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much.